The Galactic Empire's iron grip extended to every corner of the known galaxy, but nowhere was it felt more acutely than on the outer rim colonies. For humanity, an unwelcome addition to the Empire's fold. The colonies were both a sanctuary and a prison. On the desolate world of Zentaur 7, humans lived under the constant shadow of alien overlords, their every action scrutinized, their every breath tolerated only so long as it served the Empire's needs. It was here, in the cold, dust-laden wind of the Zentaur outskirts, that Marcus Renfield's life was shattered. Marcus was a farmer, a simple man who found peace in the methodical rhythm of planting and harvesting. The war that had consigned humans to second-class status in the Empire's hierarchy was history to him, a distant wound he had learned to live with. His focus now was on his son, Elias, an 8-year-old with an insatiable curiosity and the kind of mischievous smile that softened the hardest of days. The day began as it always did, with the rising of Zenner's pale twin suns. Marcus was repairing the irrigation system when Elias came bounding toward him, clutching a battered hollow pad. "Dad, look what I found!" the boy exclaimed, his voice bubbling with excitement. Marcus couldn't help but smile as Elias babbled about a long-forgotten Earth legend he'd discovered in the archives, a tale of heroes who stood against impossible odds. But the warmth of that moment evaporated when the sky darkened. A low hum vibrated through the air, growing into the menacing roar of Imperial dropships. Marcus's heart sank as he looked up to see the unmistakable black-and-silver crafts descending toward the settlement. He grabbed Elias and hurried toward the house, his mind racing with warnings that no human dared to ignore. The dropships landed in the center of the settlement, kicking up a storm of red dust. The Imperial patrol emerged, towering reptilian figures clad in sleek, obsidian armor. At their head was Commander Thraxer, a cold, calculating enforcer infamous for his ruthlessness. The air grew heavier as he stepped forward, his slit-pupiled eyes scanning the gathered humans with a predator's disdain. "Citizens," Thraxer hissed, his voice amplified by the translator unit embedded in his chest plate. "You stand accused of harboring dissidents. In accordance with Imperial law, compliance is non-negotiable." The accusation was absurd. There were no dissidents here, only farmers and their families. But the Empire's logic didn't require truth, only submission. A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Marcus held Elias close, whispering assurances he didn't believe. What happened next unfolded with brutal swiftness. A child, a boy no older than Elias, stumbled forward, his face pale with terror. One of the soldiers raised a weapon, its barrel glowing with deadly energy. "No!" a voice shouted. It was Marcus. The word tore from his throat before he could think, raw and instinctive. All eyes turned to him, including Thraxer's. "You would interfere with Imperial justice?" the commander asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Marcus froze. He knew what defiance meant, but the sight of that child, trembling under the soldier's weapon, ignited something he couldn't suppress. "He's just a kid," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you think he's done, he doesn't deserve to die." Thraxer tilted his head, as though considering Marcus's words. Then he gestured, and the soldier lowered his weapon. Relief washed over Marcus, but it was short-lived. With a flick of Thraxer's clawed hand, another soldier stepped forward and grabbed Elias. "No!" Marcus lunged, but 2 more soldiers restrained him. Elias cried out, his small body struggling against the alien's grip. "Let this be a lesson," Thraxer said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Interference will not be tolerated." And then, without ceremony, Elias was thrown to the ground. The soldier raised his weapon. Marcus screamed, his voice ragged with anguish, but the sound was drowned out by the weapon's discharge. The world seemed to slow, the vibrant energy beam searing into Elias's chest. The boy's body went limp, his once bright eyes staring into nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus collapsed to his knees, his mind unable to grasp the horror before him. The patrol departed as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving behind a broken man and a grieving settlement. Days passed, but for Marcus, time held no meaning. He sat in the ruins of his home, clutching the hollow pad Elias had cherished. The legends of Earth's heroes now felt like cruel mockery. Yet, beneath the crushing weight of despair, a spark flickered. It began as anger, hot, consuming, and aimless. But as the days turned into weeks, that anger crystallized into something sharper. Marcus realized he couldn't let this atrocity go unanswered. He had no power, no resources, but he had a truth the Empire couldn't erase. They had murdered his son, and he would make them answer for it. Marcus's search for justice led him to a name, Darien Voss. Once a celebrated human advocate in the Galactic Court, Darien had earned a reputation for fearlessly challenging the Empire. But that was before the system broke him, reducing him to a shadow of his former self. Finding Darien wasn't easy. He lived on Valter Station, a decaying hub at the edge of the galaxy. When Marcus finally stood before him, he saw a man age beyond his years, his eyes dulled by too many defeats. "Go home," Darien said, his voice flat. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." But Marcus wouldn't leave. He spoke of Elias, of the massacre, of the unyielding pain that refused to let him rest. He laid the hollow pad on Darien's cluttered desk, its screen flickering to life with a recording of the massacre. Darien watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When the recording ended, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You know what happens to people who challenge the Empire," he said. "I know," Marcus replied, "but I also know I can't live with myself if I don't try." For a long moment, Darien said nothing. Then, with a weary nod, he reached for a bottle of synthale. "You're a fool," he said, pouring himself a glass. "But maybe fools are what we need right now." As Marcus left Darien's quarters that night, the hollow pad tucked on his arm, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step toward justice. Darien Voss sat alone in his dimly lit chamber, a half-empty glass of synthale on the table beside him. The flickering light from the hollow pad cast eerie shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by years of bitter disillusionment. The recording Marcus Renfield had shown him played again. He didn't need to watch it. He could still hear the crack of the Imperial weapon, see the small, lifeless body crumpling to the ground. He had spent years shielding himself from the weight of such tragedies. Humanity had no place in the Galactic Court, no voice, no future. To fight against the Empire was to invite despair. Yet now, as the images replayed in his mind, something stirred within him. He had buried his ideals long ago, but perhaps they weren't gone. Perhaps Marcus's unyielding grief had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. By the next morning, Darien had made his decision. He found Marcus waiting in the rusted dining hall of the station, sitting at a table with his hands clenched around a steaming cup of CAF. When Darien approached, Marcus looked up, his eyes bloodshot but resolute. "I'll take your case," Darien said without preamble. "But you need to understand something. This isn't justice. The Empire doesn't care about the law. This is war, and we're outnumbered." Marcus's grip on the cup tightened, but he nodded. "I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking for a chance." The first challenge was evidence. An emotional plea wouldn't sway the Galactic Court, not against an empire that wielded propaganda like a weapon. The massacre on Zentar, 7 would be dismissed as a necessary action against rebellion unless Darien could prove otherwise. Their first lead came from a data broker on Valter Station, a wiry man named Corin who spoke with a perpetual smirk. Corin claimed to have intercepted Imperial communications regarding a directive codenamed Protocol 9, rumored to target human settlements specifically. The cost of the information was steep. Darien had to part with the last of his savings, but what Corin provided was invaluable. Encrypted records suggesting that the massacre on Zentar 7 wasn't an isolated incident. "This is bigger than I thought," Darien muttered as he sifted through the data on his terminal. "The Empire's been systematically targeting human colonies for years. "We've always known they hate us," Marcus replied, standing behind him. "This is the first time we've had proof." But proof wasn't enough. To win in court, they needed witnesses. People who could testify to the atrocities they'd endured. Darian reached out to an old contact, Commander Elias Kane, a former human military officer who had survived the collapse of Earth's defenses. Kane now operated in the shadows, leading a resistance network scattered across the galaxy. Meeting Kane was a risk. The resistance was a prime target for Imperial crackdowns, and associating with them could end the case before it even began. But Darian knew they had no choice. He and Marcus met Kane in a derelict outpost orbiting a gas giant, where the air smelled of oil and despair. Kane was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face marked by scars and a demeanor hardened by years of battle. "I heard about Zentaur 7, he said, his voice low and gravelly. "What happened to your son was barbaric." He looked at Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry." Marcus nodded stiffly. "Sorry doesn't bring him back. I want justice." "You're aiming high," Kane said, his gaze shifting to Darian. "The Galactic Court is a circus. Even if you get the case heard, the Empire will bury you." "They'll try," Darian replied. "But if we win, it won't just be about Zentaur 7. It'll expose the Empire's crimes across the galaxy. That's worth the risk." Kane studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "I'll help, but you'll need more than evidence. You'll need leverage." Leverage came in the form of Dr. Varric Thal, an alien scientist who had once worked for the Empire. Varric's species, the Ansrith, had long been allies of the Imperial regime, but he had grown disillusioned with their methods. Kane arranged for Darian and Marcus to meet him in a hidden facility deep within an asteroid field. Varric was smaller than they expected, his slender frame swathed in a dark cloak. His sharp, blue eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "You're asking me to betray the Empire," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you know what they do to traitors?" "We know what they do to children," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with anger. Varric flinched, but he didn't argue. "I have data," he said finally. "Files from Project Cleve. It's the directive behind Protocol 9. It outlines the Empire's policy of targeting humans, labeling them as biologically inferior and a threat to galactic stability." The room fell silent. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Darian's hands clenched into fists. The cold, clinical language of genocide was something they had suspected but never had the means to prove. "You'll testify?" Darian asked. Varric hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "I'll provide the data, but appearing in court, it's suicide. It's not just your survival at stake," Marcus said, his voice hard. "If you don't speak out, they'll keep killing. Not just humans. Anyone who doesn't fit their vision of the galaxy." Varric looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. He nodded slowly. "I'll testify." With Varric's data and testimony secured, Darian began preparing for the trial. He pored over every precedent, every loophole that might give them a fighting chance. Meanwhile, Marcus worked with Kane to identify other survivors willing to testify. The Galactic Court was a vast and imposing structure, a towering spire of obsidian and steel that loomed over the planet of Acheris Prime. Darian had been there before, but as he approached its gates with Marcus at his side, he felt a weight settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for humanity's survival. Inside, the Empire's representative awaited them. Prosecutor Zalthar Kor was a tall, serpentine figure with a voice like silk and a reputation for crushing dissent. He smiled thinly as they entered, his yellow eyes glinting with malice. "You must be the human advocate," Zalthar said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I admire your optimism. It's almost endearing." Darian ignored him, focusing instead on the task ahead. As the court convened, he rose to deliver his opening statement. His voice rang clear in the cavernous chamber, echoing off the cold walls. "Members of the court," he began, "we are here today not just to seek justice for the victims of Zentaur 7, but to confront the systemic atrocities that threaten the very fabric of our galaxy. He glanced at Marcus, who sat in the audience, his face a mask of quiet determination. For a moment, their eyes met, and Darian drew strength from the fire he saw there. "This is not just a case," Darian continued. "This is a reckoning." As he sat down, the silence in the chamber was palpable. The Empire had always relied on fear to suppress its victims. But now, for the first time, the truth was being spoken in the heart of its power. It was only the beginning, but Darian knew they had taken the first step towards something greater. Whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, they were no longer invisible. The Galactic Court's chambers were as cold and unfeeling as the Empire itself. Towering obsidian walls stretched upward into a dome of shimmering lights, designed to remind all who entered that the Empire's gaze was infinite. Darian Voss stood at the central podium, feeling the weight of that gaze pressing down on him. Around the circular chamber, judges from a dozen species, some sympathetic, others openly hostile, watched in silence. Behind them, rows of spectators filled the gallery, their whispered voices a mix of curiosity and contempt. At the far end of the courtroom stood Prosecutor Zaltercore, tall and composed, his serpentine form radiating smug confidence. His yellow eyes met Darian's briefly, and the corner of his mouth twisted into a faint, predatory smile. Darian knew that smile. It was the expression of a man who believed he'd already won. The trial began with Zalter's opening argument. His voice, smooth and deliberate, filled the chamber like a venomous fog. "Esteemed members of this court," he began, his words dripping with feigned civility, "we are here today because a grieving human seeks to weaponize tragedy against the very institution that has preserved galactic peace for centuries." He paced slowly, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. The events on Zentar 7 were not an atrocity, as the prosecution claims, but a necessary enforcement of order. The so-called evidence you will see today has been distorted to vilify the Empire, while ignoring the dangerous insurgencies that plague human colonies. As Zalter spoke, Darian studied the faces of the judges. Most remained impassive, their expressions unreadable, but a few nodded faintly in agreement with the prosecutor's words. The Empire's propaganda was a powerful weapon, and Zalter wielded it with precision. When it was Darian's turn to speak, he stood, adjusting his plain gray robes. He felt the stares of the gallery boring into him, the weight of Marcus Renfield's expectations in every breath. Taking a deep breath, he stepped to the podium and began. "Members of the court," he said, his voice steady but firm, "this trial is not about rebellion or insurgency. It is about the systematic dehumanization of an entire species. It is about the murder of innocent children under the guise of law." The gallery grew quiet, the murmurs fading as Darian's words echoed through the chamber. "The Empire would have you believe this is an isolated incident. It is not. Today, I will show you the truth, a truth they have worked tirelessly to suppress. Zentar 7 was not a mistake. It was a policy." As he sat down, he caught a glimpse of Marcus in the gallery. The man's expression was stoic, but his clenched fist betrayed the storm raging within him. Darian's words had set the tone, but it was the evidence that would decide the trial's fate. The first witness was a survivor from Zentar 7, an elderly farmer named Joran Mathis. He walked slowly to the stand, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his grief. As he recounted the events of that day, his voice cracked with emotion. "They came without warning," Joran said, his hands trembling. "We were just farmers. The children, they didn't even have a chance to run. They lined them up like animals." His voice faltered, and he looked down, unable to continue. Zalter wasted no time in tearing into the man's testimony. "Isn't it true," he asked, his tone icy, "that your settlement had been harboring fugitives? That weapons were found among your belongings?" "We had no weapons," Joran said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We had nothing but accusations," Zalter replied, his words striking like a whip. "Your settlement's records indicate communication with known dissident groups. Are you denying this? Joran hesitated, his confusion clear. The Empire had fabricated evidence before. Darien had warned him of this possibility. But the hesitation was enough. Zalthar turned to the judges, his expression one of practiced indignation. The Empire does not act without cause, he declared. Darien clenched his fists but forced himself to remain calm. He needed more than testimony to counter Zalthar's tactics. The key lay in the data provided by Dr. Varek, who was scheduled to testify next. When Varek stepped forward, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The slender Ansrith scientist moved nervously, his eyes darting around the chamber as though expecting an ambush. Darien met his gaze briefly, offering a nod of reassurance. Varek took the stand, his voice trembling as he introduced himself. I was a senior analyst for the Empire, he began, his words halting. My work involved population control policies. Population control, Darien interjected. Could you clarify what that means? Varek hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his cloak. It means targeting species deemed problematic. Humans were classified as one such species under Protocol 9. The gallery erupted into murmurs, and one of the judges, a crystalline being with a glowing core, raised a limb to restore order. Darien seized a moment. Dr. Thal, do you have evidence of this protocol? Yes, Varek said, his voice growing steadier. I brought files. They outline the directives for suppressing human populations, including the targeting of children to break the will of the colonies. Darien approached the stand and activated a projection from the data Varek had provided. The hologram displayed cold, clinical documents bearing the Empire's seal. One line stood out in stark clarity. Asterisk infant and juvenile populations represent a critical leverage point for compliance. Asterisk. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even some of the judges shifted uncomfortably. Darien let the silence linger before turning back to the court. This is the truth the Empire wants to hide, he said, his voice rising. They call it population control. I call it genocide. Zalthar was quick to respond, his voice calm but edged with venom. This so-called evidence could have been fabricated. The word of a traitor, he gestured toward Varek, is hardly credible. But the damage was done. The hologram remained suspended in the air, its damning words impossible to ignore. As the trial continued, more witnesses testified, each adding weight to the growing case against the Empire. Marcus Renfield took the stand last, his presence a final, emotional blow. He spoke of his son, of the laughter that had filled their home, of the bright future stolen by an act of unthinkable cruelty. Elias was 8, Marcus said, his voice breaking. He didn't understand war or politics. He just wanted to live. When Darien asked him why he had come to the court, Marcus's answer was simple. Because someone has to speak for those who can't. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. For a moment, even Zalthar had no retort. As the session adjourned for deliberation, Darien felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared hope for, belief. The Empire's grip on the court was strong, but cracks had begun to form. Whether they would widen into a victory remained uncertain. But for the first time, he could see the possibility. As he exited the chamber, Marcus walked beside him, his expression grim but determined. Do you think they'll listen? Marcus asked. Darien glanced back at the dark spire of the courtroom, its shadow stretching across the city. They've heard us, he said quietly. Now we'll see if they have the courage to act. The Galactic Court was a fortress of silence. Hours stretched into days as the judges deliberated behind the towering obsidian walls, their inscrutable forms hidden from the world outside. The city surrounding the court hummed with quiet tension, its streets alive with whispers of rebellion, fear, and hope. Within the gray confines of his assigned quarters, Darien Voss paced, his thoughts as restless as his footsteps. Marcus sat at the room's only table, staring down at a small hollow projection of his son. The boy's laughter was frozen in time, his eyes bright with the kind of innocence the galaxy had long since forgotten. What if it wasn't enough? Marcus asked suddenly, his voice raw with the weight of unanswered prayers. Darien stopped pacing and turned to him. It was more than enough, he said, though his own doubt gnawed at him. The truth is out there now, whether they admit it or not. They can't unsee what we've shown them. Marcus nodded but said nothing. He simply stared at the hollow, as if memorizing every detail. The summons to the courtroom came on the third day. The air was heavy with anticipation as Darien and Marcus joined the crowd, filing into the vast chamber. The gallery was packed. The faces of every species turned toward the judge's bench, where 12 towering figures now sat, their expressions carved from stone. At the center sat Chief Arbiter Lorvek, a towering reptilian with scales that shimmered like polished metal. His voice, deep and resonant, carried through the chamber as he addressed the court. "We have reached a verdict," he said, his tone devoid of any hint of emotion. Darien stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face carefully neutral. Beside him, Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Zalter Kor, standing across the room, looked as calm as ever, his serpentine eyes betraying no concern. "The case presented by Advocate Voss has raised serious allegations against the Galactic Empire," Lorvek began, his words measured. "The evidence provided, including testimony and recovered imperial directives, has been thoroughly examined. The court acknowledges the gravity of these claims and the unprecedented nature of this trial." Darien felt his chest tighten. Every syllable felt like a blade suspended over their heads. "The court finds," Lorvek continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, "the Empire guilty of crimes against sentient life in its actions on Zentar 7 and other human colonies." The chamber erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, punctuated by the muffled cries of those who had dared to hope. Marcus let out a shuddering breath, his hands covering his face as he struggled to contain the flood of emotion. Darien remained still, his mind struggling to process the words. Against all odds they had won. But Lorvek's voice cut through the noise, commanding silence once more. "This court does not possess the authority to dismantle the Galactic Empire. However, we decree that those responsible for the Zentar 7 massacre, including the officers who carried out Protocol 9, shall be held accountable for their actions. They will be remanded to the custody of this court to face execution." Darien's eyes flicked toward Zalter, whose calm facade had finally cracked. The prosecutor's face twisted in rage as he stepped forward. "This is a mockery of justice," he snarled. "You condemn us for preserving order, yet ignore the chaos humanity spreads wherever it goes." Lorvek's cold gaze fixed on Zalter. "Order built on genocide is no order at all. The court's decision is final." Zalter's lips curled into a snarl, but he said nothing further. Darien suspected this wasn't over. The Empire would never accept this ruling without retaliation. Outside the courtroom, the crowd was already swelling. News of the verdict spread like wildfire, and humans across the galaxy celebrated the first crack in the Empire's seemingly unbreakable facade. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. As he stepped into the sunlight, the weight of loss remained heavy on his shoulders. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Darien looked out over the crowd, his expression grim. "This was only the beginning," he said. "The Empire will fight back. They'll try to silence this, bury it in propaganda, maybe even retaliation. But for now, they've been exposed." Kane emerged from the crowd, his face unreadable. "You did it," he said, clapping Darien on the shoulder. "But he's right. This won't stop the Empire. Not yet." "It's a start," Marcus said firmly. "And starts are what revolutions are built on." In the days that followed, the Empire's grip on the galaxy began to waver. Protests erupted on dozens of planets, and even some Imperial-aligned species began questioning their allegiance. The executions of the officers responsible for Zentar 7 were broadcast across the galaxy, a public spectacle meant to placate the masses. But the Empire's retaliation came swiftly. Human settlements faced increased military presence, and whispers of new purges began to spread. Darien knew they had drawn blood, but the fight was far from over. In a quiet moment, Marcus found Darien in a dimly lit corner of the Resistance's headquarters. "You could walk away now," Marcus said. "You've done more than anyone could have asked." Darien shook his head. "Walking away won't change anything. If we stop now, the Empire will recover. We have to keep fighting." Marcus offered a faint smile, one touched with sadness but also resolve. "Then we fight together." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their task hanging between them. Somewhere beyond the walls, the galaxy churned with uncertainty, its future as fragile as the hope they had ignited. For Darien, the victory in court was not an end, but a declaration. Humanity would no longer be silent. And for Marcus, it was a promise to his son that his death would not be in vain. The war was far from over, but the first battle had been won. The Empire had been shown that even the smallest voices, when united, could shatter the strongest walls. And somewhere in the cold expanse of space, a spark had been lit, a spark that would one day become a fire.